The fire in the White Hart's front parlor had burned low by the time the Duke of Ashmore walked through the door, and every person in that room felt the cold that came in behind him before they felt anything else. Josephine Campbell felt it from the window alcove where she sat with a book she had not been reading. She watched him cross the threshold in 3 measured strides, his greatcoat dark with the January damp, his face carrying the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself to arrive at places without appearing to have traveled to them. The innkeeper, Mr. Finch, came forward at a near trot. The 2 women by the fire, strangers traveling south, gathered their shawls closer and looked elsewhere, as people of middling station do when rank enters a room they have briefly believed was theirs. What Josephine did not expect was that his gaze would cross the room and pause on her for the length of a held breath before moving to Mr. Finch. She pressed her thumb flat against the page she was not reading and told herself it meant nothing. She had heard he was coming. She had heard it from Clara, who had heard it from the ostler, who had heard it from the Duke's outrider when the man came ahead to secure rooms, the Duke of Ashmore, traveling from London, stopping at the White Hart, seeking information about a letter, her letter. She had posted it 3 weeks ago with her last shilling and a steady hand, addressed to Mr. Stowe at his London offices, marked for the Duke's attention, and signed only with the initials J.C. She had not given her name because she had not believed her name would matter. She had believed the information would matter. £900 bled from the Ashmore estate accounts over 3 years, documented in the ledger she had handled for her employer, Mrs. Aldgate, in the weeks before Mrs. Aldgate died, and left Josephine with nothing but a carpet bag and a precise memory for figures. She had not expected the Duke to come to the letter. She had expected him to send someone, to resolve the matter quietly, and to never know the name behind the initials. He had come himself. The book fell shut in her hands, and she set it on the windowsill with care, as though stillness might make her less visible. It did not. The woman who had entered behind the Duke, arranging her gloves in the doorway with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making entrances, had already found her. Lady Maren Vane, the Duke's widowed aunt, wore violet silk and a composed expression, and her eyes moved across the room the way a housewife's hand moves across a pantry shelf, inventorying what is present and what is out of place. Josephine, in her gray wool with the mended cuff, was apparently out of place. "Who is that creature at the window?" Lady Maren murmured to the woman behind her, not lowering her voice sufficiently. "And why has Mr. Finch allowed a person in service to sit in the common parlor?" The woman behind Lady Maren said nothing. Josephine heard the words with the clarity of someone accustomed to overhearing judgments, and she kept her hand still in her lap, and she did not look away. The Duke did not appear to hear, or perhaps he chose not to. He was speaking to Mr. Finch, his voice low, his gloved hand at rest on the top rail of a chair. What she did not yet know was that he had heard every word. The first 3 days at the White Hart had been managed on the small sum Clara had declined to accept from Josephine, and then accepted anyway, when Josephine refused the refusal with sufficient firmness. Clara Finch, born Clara Marsh, had been Josephine's schoolfellow at the Ashton Academy 12 years ago, when Josephine's father still had the £4,200 worth of solvency that later vanished into the debt that killed him, and when Clara had still been the girl who cried during examinations and cheated at French by writing conjugations on the inside of her wrist. Clara was now a woman of 30, with a 7-year-old daughter named Bess, and a husband who ran the White Hart with reasonable competence and a tendency to over-order ale. Clara had given Josephine the small room above the kitchen without ceremony and without pity, which was exactly what Josephine needed from her. She needed shelter while she found a new position. She had written 3 letters of application in the past week and received no replies. She had also, evidently, summoned a duke. The problem was not merely that he had come. The problem was that she could not explain the letter to him without explaining her former employer's private accounts, which she had handled in confidence, and which would raise the immediate question of why she had not brought the matter to the appropriate authorities rather than writing to the Duke anonymously. And the answer, which was that she had trusted no one in the local courts and had believed a direct approach to the Duke himself was the only certain route, did not reflect well on a woman of no standing who was already lacking a reference. She had made a decision in good faith. The difficulty with decisions made in good faith was that they rarely protected the person who made them. She retrieved the book from the windowsill and opened it to the wrong page. The Duke's name was Aldrich Vane, though she had not spoken it aloud and did not intend to. He was 31 years old, according to Clara, who had gleaned this from the outrider as well. He had inherited the dukedom at 26, following his father's death from a fall, and he had spent the 5 years since in the efficient and apparently joyless management of an estate that generations of vain spending had brought to the edge of serious difficulty. He had also, somewhere in those 5 years, lost a wife. Josephine had not known this until Clara told her, the morning after the Duke's arrival, while pressing her hands around a warm cup at the kitchen table and delivering the intelligence with the particular gravity Clara reserved for information she considered essential. She died in childbed, Clara said. The baby, too. He was away at the time, something about the estate tenants, some emergency. He came back and she was already gone. Josephine held the cup and said nothing. He is not remarried, Clara continued, as though this were the extraordinary part. Josephine understood, without requiring further explanation, that a man who had been absent when his wife died would find a reason to believe the absence had been the cause. It was the kind of logic that grief constructed in the dark, self-punishing and precise, resistant to comfort. She did not know what it had done to him over 5 years. She knew what it looked like from the outside, a stillness that cost something to maintain. She had gone back upstairs and found she could not read. If someone had asked Josephine to describe the first morning in the White Hart's common parlor after the Duke's arrival, she would have said it was uneventful. The Duke ate his breakfast at the private table Mr. Finch had arranged near the window, read correspondence, and spoke to no one except his solicitor, Mr. Stowe, who arrived on the second day from London by post-chaise, looking harassed and carrying a heavy leather case. She would not have mentioned, because it would not have been a relevant detail, that the Duke had asked Mr. Finch about the guests currently resident at the White Hart, and that Mr. Finch had listed them by name, and that when he reached Miss Josephine Campbell, companion, currently without a position, the Duke had set down his coffee cup and asked how long she had been there. She had not been present for this exchange. She learned of it from Clara, who had been present. Clara had also reported that the Duke had said nothing further, had picked his coffee cup back up, and had returned to his correspondence. Clara reported this with her particular expression. That meant she believed it was significant and was waiting for Josephine to agree. Josephine agreed privately that it was significant. She was not prepared to agree aloud. The incident with Bess happened on the second afternoon. Bess Finch was 7 years old and possessed of the particular social confidence that belongs to children raised in inns, who have learned early that rooms full of strangers are navigable because strangers, unlike family, are easily escaped. She had a habit of appearing in the common parlor with a book that was too old for her and situating herself near whichever guest seemed least likely to send her away. She had chosen Josephine twice in the past week, which Josephine had found unexpectedly consoling. On the second afternoon, she appeared at the door of the parlor carrying a small gray rabbit, a stuffed one, cotton batting visible at one worn seam, and began to cross the room toward the fireplace where Lady Maren had installed herself with needlework and a companion. Lady Maren saw the child at the same moment Josephine did. "This is a parlor for guests," Lady Maren said, without looking up from her needlework. "Not a nursery. Whoever owns this child should confine her." Bess stopped. She was 7. And she understood tone, if not vocabulary. And she understood that she had been found insufficient. In some way she could not yet name. Her hand tightened on the rabbit's ear. "She is the innkeeper's daughter," Josephine said from her chair. "She has the freedom of the house." Lady Maren looked up then. The expression was not angry. It was the expression of a person confronted by someone who has spoken out of turn and must now be corrected into understanding what turn is theirs. "I beg your pardon," Lady Maren said. "She is 7 years old," Josephine said, "and she has done nothing to merit being told she does not belong in her own home." There was a silence. The 2 traveling women by the window had stilled. Somewhere in the corridor, a door had stopped moving. "You are the companion," Lady Maren said, "without a position." "At present," Josephine agreed. "I wonder," Lady Maren said, returning her gaze to the needlework, "that you have the leisure to concern yourself with other people's household arrangements, given your own situation." Josephine rose from her chair, crossed the room, and held out her hand to Bess. The child came to her immediately, which was its own kind of testimony. She led Bess out into the corridor and knelt beside her there, and said quietly that Lady Maren was a woman who had grown so accustomed to the arrangement of rooms that she had forgotten rooms were made for people, and that Bess was a person of considerable quality. And the rabbit was handsome besides. Bess examined this assessment and appeared to find it acceptable. She went back toward the kitchen with her rabbit, and Josephine straightened and found the Duke standing at the far end of the corridor. He had come from the direction of the private dining room. He had, she calculated, been there long enough to hear most of it. His expression gave her nothing. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her across the parlor on the first evening, with that quality of attention that was not quite a question and not quite a judgment, but something between them that she could not name. She inclined her head. He inclined his. She walked back toward the stairs, and he did not stop her. He did not leave the following morning as he had planned. Clara mentioned this at breakfast with an air of scientific neutrality that convinced no one. Josephine went about the business of the day. She wrote another letter of application, this one to a Mrs. Hargrove in Bath, who required a companion for the winter season. She read 3 pages of the same volume she had been unable to read since the Duke arrived. She helped Clara with the inventory of the linen press, because Clara's girl had counted wrong, and they were apparently missing 4 tablecloths, which turned out to be in the laundry. That evening, the Duke sat in the common parlor, which he had not done before, and read beside the fire while his solicitor wrote at the desk in the corner, and Lady Maren occupied the chair nearest the hearth, with her needlework. Josephine sat in the window alcove again. At some point she became aware that the Duke had not turned a page in some time. She looked at the window instead of looking at him, at the dark glass and her own pale reflection, and she listened to the fire settle and the clock mark the quarter hour and Lady Maren say in a voice pitched for the companion beside her, "I cannot account for some people's persistence. The inn offers accommodation, not social standing." Josephine did not respond. She was, by this point, practiced in not responding. What she could not account for was the Duke's voice, measured and quiet, and aimed at no one in particular, saying, "The common parlor is common to everyone in the inn, Aunt. That is what the word means." Lady Marin's needlework paused. 1 beat. 2. Then resumed. He had not looked at Josephine when he said it. He looked at his book. She looked at the dark glass. The fire settled once more, and the quarter hour turned, and she was very careful not to let anything show in her face, though her hands, which were not visible to the room, were pressed flat and hard against her thighs. The conversation she had been dreading came on the 4th morning. She had come down early, before the dining room opened, to speak with Clara about the letter from Mrs. Hargrove, which had arrived in the Morning Post and contained what appeared to be a conditional offer. Clara was in the kitchen. Josephine crossed the corridor past the private dining room. And the door was open. And the Duke was there alone, standing at the window with a cup of coffee and a letter she recognized. Her letter. She recognized her own hand, even at distance, even folded. She would have continued walking, but he spoke without turning. "Miss Campbell." She stopped. "Will you come in?" It was not quite a question. She entered, and he turned from the window, and in the gray morning light she could see that he had been reading for some time, the evidence of it in the slight tension around his eyes. He set the coffee cup down on the sideboard. "You wrote to my solicitor," he said. "Unsigned." She held herself still. "I did." "You described a systematic alteration of 3 years' estate accounts," he said. "Specific figures, column references, names?" He looked at her with that quality of attention that, close and in daylight, was more difficult to meet than she had prepared for. "The information is precise enough to prosecute." "It is accurate," she said. "How did you come by it?" "My previous employer, Mrs. Aldgate, had business interests adjacent to the Ashmore accounts through her late husband's trust," Josephine said. "I managed her correspondence in the last year of her life. One of the documents that came across my desk was a ledger copy, the Ashmore estate ledger, for the purpose of confirming a small loan repayment. I compared the figures I saw there to the figures published in the estate summary the following year. They did not agree. The discrepancy over 3 years reached £900. "Why did you not go to the magistrate?" "Because the magistrate in that district is the steward's brother-in-law," she said. "I considered it and concluded it would not serve." Something shifted in his face. "Not much." "Enough." "Why did you not sign the letter?" She looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because a letter from a dismissed companion with no reference and no position carries less weight than the information itself. I did not want you to dismiss what I wrote because of who wrote it." He was quiet. Then, "You were not dismissed. Your employer died." "The effect is the same," she said. He looked down at the letter in his hand. Outside, the yard was beginning to stir, a horse being led across the cobbles, the ostler calling to someone, the ordinary machinery of a winter morning resuming. "You spent your last shilling on the postage," he said. It was not a question. She had mentioned it nowhere in the letter, and so he must have heard it from some other source. Possibly Mr. Finch. Possibly Clara. The knowledge that he had inquired sat in her chest like a stone pressed warm. "I considered it a reasonable expenditure," she said. He set the letter on the sideboard beside the coffee cup, smoothing it flat with one hand. And then he looked at her again with that expression that was not quite a question, and not quite anything she had a name for. And he said, "I see." She was not certain what he saw. She was fairly certain he saw more than she had intended. She went back into the corridor and stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides, and she told herself firmly that she had been sensible, and she had answered honestly, and she had not revealed anything she could not afford to have revealed, and whatever she was feeling now was merely the natural consequence of speaking plainly to a person of consequence after weeks of keeping her own counsel. She did not succeed in convincing herself. Lady Marin moved against her on the 5th day. It began with a conversation between Lady Marin and the wife of a justice of the peace from Derby, a Mrs. Cavendish, who had taken a room for 2 nights while her carriage wheel was being repaired. Mrs. Cavendish was precisely the sort of woman Lady Marin found useful. Respected in her own circle, credulous, and attentive to the social determinations of women she considered above her. Lady Marin sat with her in the parlor in the afternoon, and over the course of an hour, just audibly enough for the room to overhear, she built a version of events. The version went as follows. An anonymous letter had reached the Duke alleging fraud in his household. The letter was, upon examination, suspiciously convenient. Its author had clearly read enough of the estate accounts to construct a plausible story. But who would have access to such accounts? A companion, perhaps, one who had been recently dismissed from service, or whose employer had conveniently died, leaving no one to vouch for her. And was it not notable that such a woman had been staying at the White Hart, as though waiting? And was it not possible that the letter had been designed not to expose fraud, but to bring the Duke here, to this inn, where a woman of no means might make an impression? Mrs. Cavendish agreed that it was possible. She agreed with a gravity that suggested she found the theory compelling. Josephine, who was not in the parlor during this exchange but heard it in its entirety from Clara, who had been serving tea, spent the evening in her room above the kitchen, reviewing her options. She had 3. She could leave the White Hart before Lady Marin's version of her became the established one. She could find a way to present her case to the Duke directly, fully, including the parts she had not yet told him. Or she could wait and be consumed by a story that had no room in it for the truth. Leaving was, in practical terms, her most sensible choice. She had the conditional offer from Mrs. Hargrove. She could write a reply tonight and accept, and be on the coach to Bath within 48 hours, and leave the Duke of Ashmore and his solicitor and his £900 of documented fraud to resolve themselves without her. She sat at the small table in her room and laid her hands flat on the wood surface and looked at them. She had written that letter because it was the right thing to do, because a man was being stolen from at a rate of £900 over 3 years, and she had happened to be in the position to see it and to say so. She had not written it for money. She had not written it to attract his attention. She had written it because her father, who had been a man of careless finances but precise principles, had told her once that the only thing a person of small means could offer the world was honesty, because it cost the same regardless of income. She was not going to leave. On the morning of the 6th day, Lady Marin brought it into the open. The common parlor held, at the moment of the scene's beginning, the Duke, Mr. Stowe, Mrs. Cavendish, 2 men traveling north who had come in from the cold, and Josephine, who had come downstairs with her letter to Mrs. Hargrove and had not yet made it to the post. Clara was by the door with a tray. Lady Marin entered from the corridor and arranged herself near the fire and said in her carrying, pleasant voice, "I understand you have been unable to verify the letter's claims, Aldrich. Perhaps the investigation should begin with the author." The Duke, who had been speaking quietly with Mr. Stowe, said nothing. "Miss Campbell has been resident at this inn for nearly a week," Lady Marin continued, addressing the room generally, with the confidence of a woman who has spent 30 years shaping the opinion of rooms. "A young woman, alone, without employment or reference, who possesses apparently a detailed knowledge of your estate's private accounts." She smiled pleasantly. "One wonders how she came by it." Mrs. Cavendish made a sound of concerned agreement. "One also wonders," Lady Marin said, "whether the fraud she describes is as well documented as her letter suggests, or whether the letter itself was the document, manufactured to establish a claim. The room had gone the particular quiet of people who are not certain which direction the social wind is blowing and have decided to wait for someone else to move first. Josephine looked at Lady Marin for a moment. The letter to Mrs. Hargrove was in her hand. She thought of her father. She thought of £900 taken from accounts over 3 years. She thought of a man in grey morning light, pressing a letter flat with one hand. "I wrote the letter," she said. The room's quiet deepened. "I signed it with my initials. I did so because I had evidence of a systematic discrepancy in the Ashmore estate accounts that I believed the Duke had a right to know, and I had no other means of ensuring the information reached him." "Evidence," Lady Marin said, with a pleasantness that had an edge running through it. "Produced from where, precisely?" "From a ledger copy I examined in the course of my employment, comparing those figures to the published estate summary," Josephine said. "The discrepancy over 3 years was £900. I documented each instance in the letter." "You had access to private estate accounts," Lady Marin said. "A companion, without position or connection, and your employer, conveniently, is no longer alive to confirm this account." She paused. "I do not say you are a liar, Miss Campbell. I say only that your story is one that cannot be verified. The men traveling north had found the ceiling very interesting." Mrs. Cavendish was looking at Josephine with the expression of a person who has already decided the matter. Clara had gone very still by the door. "The account books can be verified," Josephine said. "That is precisely what I wrote to Mr. Stowe about. The figures are there, if someone examines the right columns." "Mr. Stowe's examination has thus far been inconclusive," Lady Marin said, which was not, Josephine noted, the same as saying it was complete. "Then it should continue," Josephine said. Lady Marin smiled. "You are very confident for a woman of your circumstances." "I am honest," Josephine said. "The two are not the same, though I understand they can be confused." The quiet in the room was of a different quality now. Lady Marin's smile held. The Duke, whom Josephine had been carefully not looking at, had not spoken. That was the moment that felt most like defeat. Not Lady Marin's pleasant certainty, not Mrs. Cavendish's credulous head-tilting, not the assembled guests waiting to be told what to think. It was the Duke's silence that did it. She stood in the center of the room with her letter to Mrs. Hargrove in her hand and understood that she had told him the truth, and it was possible the truth was not enough. She went upstairs and did not cry, which she considered an act of considerable character. She had been in her room for perhaps an hour, sitting in the narrow chair by the window and listening to the yard below, when there was a knock at the door. She expected Clara. It was the Duke. He stood in the doorway of the small room above the kitchen in his coat and gloves, and he looked, briefly, at the carpet-bag in the corner, and the single candle on the table, and the letter to Mrs. Hargrove that she had set face down on the windowsill, and something moved across his face that she could not read. "Mr. Stowe has completed his examination," he said. She waited. "He arrived at the White Hart with the account books," he said. "Not the copies. The originals, which I requested he bring from London before I came here. I had reason to believe the copies might have been altered." He paused. "The original books confirm your figures precisely. £900 across 37 separate entries over 3 years. Her hands were folded in her lap. She kept them there. "Lady Marin did not know that when she spoke this morning," he said, "because I had not told her. I did not tell her because I did not know how far the matter had extended, or who in my household could be trusted with the information." He looked at her with a directness that took up all the available space in the small room. I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing, she said. I stood in that parlor and said nothing while you were accused of manufacturing a fraud that you in fact exposed, he said. And I did it, because I was still determining the extent of the deception, and I was not prepared to reveal that Mr. Stowe was waiting downstairs with the original books. He paused. That is the reason, not an excuse, and I am aware they are not the same thing. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the window, at the darkness outside, and the first small flakes of snow beginning to settle against the glass. Why did you come yourself? She said. You could have sent someone. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, I trusted no one in my household with the matter. The steward has been with the estate for 11 years. I did not know how far the deception extended, or who else might be complicit. And I thought, he said, and stopped, and began again, more carefully. I thought that whoever had written that letter had taken a considerable risk in doing so, and that risk deserved a personal response. She looked at him. My wife died 5 years ago, he said. It was not what she had expected him to say. He said it without preamble, looking at a point slightly past her shoulder, which she understood was not evasion, but the opposite. I was 3 hours away, managing a flooding on the east boundary that the steward had reported as an emergency. It was not an emergency. The water had receded by the time I arrived. His jaw was still. She died while I was attending to a problem that did not require my attendance. Josephine understood then why the letter had mattered to him in a way that perhaps went beyond the fraud itself. A piece of paper that had told him someone in his household was stealing from him, which meant someone in his household had been deceiving him, which meant that his capacity to trust his own people's reports had been corrupted, possibly for years, including the report that had taken him away from home 5 years ago. You cannot know that the steward's report had anything to do with it, she said. No, he agreed. I cannot. He looked at her then, directly. It does not stop the question. She understood that too. There is a portrait of her at Ashmore Hall, he said after a moment. I have kept it turned to the wall. He said this as though he were not accustomed to saying it, as though the act of saying it was itself a small, costly choice. I thought it was respect. I have begun to think it may have been something else. The candle on the table had burned down by a third. The snow against the window was steady now, not heavy, but committed. I think, Josephine said, that the portrait would prefer to face the room. He looked at her for a long moment. Come downstairs, he said. Mr. Stowe has something to say, and you should be present when he says it. She rose from the narrow chair. She picked up the letter to Mrs. Hargrove from the windowsill and held it for a moment, and then set it back down. The common parlor was fuller than she had left it. Mr. Stowe had placed the original Ashmore estate account books on the writing desk, open to the relevant pages, and was standing beside them with the patient air of a man who has spent his career arriving at the necessary moment. Mrs. Cavendish was still there. The 2 men traveling north were still there. Clara stood by the door with an expression of tightly controlled satisfaction. Lady Marin occupied her chair by the fire, and her composure, which Josephine had watched function reliably for 6 days, had developed a small crack in the region of the eyes. The Duke entered ahead of Josephine and crossed the room to stand beside Mr. Stowe, and the room's attention gathered itself around him with the automatic precision of long habit. Mr. Stowe, he said. Mr. Stowe cleared his throat. The original Ashmore estate account books for the years 1812, 1813, and 1814 have been examined, he said. The discrepancies documented in the anonymous letter to my office are confirmed in full. 37 individual entries show alterations from the original figures. The total removed from the estate accounts over the 3-year period is £900 precisely. The steward, Mr. Haverley, has been suspended from his position pending the full investigation and will not be returning to Ashmore Hall. He closed the nearer volume with a sound that was quiet and final. The letter was accurate in every particular. The room absorbed this in silence. Lady Marin's fan had stopped moving. The letter was written, the Duke said, by Miss Josephine Campbell, who is resident in this inn, who had no connection to the Ashmore estate or to the steward, and who spent her last coin sending information to my solicitor because she believed it was the right thing to do. He turned from Mr. Stowe. He looked across the room at Josephine, and the quality of attention she had been trying to name since the first evening resolved itself. Standing there in the parlor of the White Hart, with snow at the windows and Clara's face at the door. Into something she now understood was neither question nor judgment, but recognition. She has no position, he said, and no reference. I intend to remedy both. Mrs. Cavendish made a small sound. Lady Marin said quietly, Aldrich, you have been wrong twice in this room, he said to her, without heat, without unkindness, in the tone of a man who has decided that clarity is more merciful than silence. Once when you named her a fortune hunter, and once when you said her account could not be verified. I should have corrected the first in the moment it was said. I did not, and that was an error of omission, for which I am responsible. He looked at his aunt with the same unsparing evenness. I will not make it again. Lady Marin looked down at the needlework in her lap. Something moved behind her eyes, a brief calculation, and then what might, in a different woman, have been the beginning of shame. Josephine stood in the middle of the room, neither flushing nor looking away, and the assembled guests looked at her as though they were seeing her for the first time, which she supposed they were. She was 23 years old, in gray wool with a mended cuff, and she had been called a creature and a fortune hunter and an impostor, and she was still standing. Clara, from the doorway, made a sound that was half exhaled breath and half something more, and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. The Duke crossed the parlor toward Josephine. He stopped at a proper distance, the distance of a man who is aware of every person in the room and is choosing his actions accordingly. And he said, in a voice that was quiet enough to be private and clear enough to carry, I would speak with you privately, if you will allow it. I will allow it, she said. If you have stayed with this story to its end, please leave a word in the comments about the moment that struck you most. Every note left there is how these stories find the next listener who needs them. They spoke in the small sitting room off the corridor, with the door left open to propriety and the fire burning at a decent height. And by the time they came back out into the corridor, Josephine had heard 3 things she had not expected to hear. The first was that he had known she had been the letter's author since the 3rd morning. Mr. Finch, when asked about the guests, had mentioned that Miss Campbell had been a companion to a Mrs. Aldgate, and Mr. Stowe had confirmed the connection to the Ashmore accounts that same afternoon. He had known for 3 days, and had said nothing, he explained, because he was still completing the examination of the books, and because he had wanted to understand what she was before he addressed what she had done. The second was that he had watched her take Bess's hand in the corridor, and had stood at the far end of that corridor not because he happened to be passing, but because he had followed her there, and had stood there for the length of time it took for him to understand that he was not going back to London on the schedule he had planned. The third was a question, formal and quiet, which she answered with a directness she had not expected from herself, saying yes in a voice that did not shake, because it was the truth, and because she had spent enough of her life managing the truth into forms that were more convenient for everyone else. She thought of the letter to Mrs. Hargrove on the windowsill upstairs, and thought that she would not need to send it after all. The snow had settled properly over the White Hart's yard by evening, a thin, even covering that made the cobbles smooth and turned the lantern light gold against the white. Josephine stood at the window of the common parlor after supper and watched a groom lead a horse across the yard with that slow, careful step that snow required. And beside her, not quite touching, the Duke stood and watched the same thing. "The portrait," she said. "Yes," he said. "It should face the room." "You said that already." "I thought it bore repeating." There was something in his silence then that was different from his other silences. Lighter. She thought, for the first time, that she could hear the beginning of something like relief in it. Clara, passing through the room with a tray, allowed herself a look at Josephine that communicated several volumes' worth of satisfaction in a single glance. Josephine accepted this with what she hoped was dignity. Lady Marin departed for London the following morning with her companion and her violet silk and her needlework, and she stopped in the corridor long enough to look at Josephine with an expression that had the quality, however slight, of acknowledgement. She said nothing. She did not need to. Josephine inclined her head, and Lady Marin inclined hers, and the door of the White Hart closed behind her, and the frost on the glass shifted in the draught. Mr. Stowe departed on the same morning, his leather case heavier with the annotated account books and a set of instructions from the Duke that would keep him occupied through the winter. Josephine went upstairs and retrieved the letter to Mrs. Hargrove and placed it in the hearth, and watched it go. Ashmore Hall in February was a building that had learned to hold warmth in its stone walls, the particular warmth of a house that has been properly maintained for generations through competence rather than excess. Josephine came to it for the first time on a Tuesday, traveling in the Duke's closed carriage with her carpet bag at her feet and Clara's wave still visible in her memory from the White Hart's door, Bess beside her with one hand raised and the rabbit tucked under her arm. She had promised to write. She intended to keep the promise. The hall was larger than she had imagined, and quieter than she had expected. A housekeeper named Mrs. Pell met her at the door with the particular evaluation that good housekeepers extend to women who are about to occupy a significant position in the household, and Josephine met the evaluation with the direct, unhurried look that she had found, over years of managing other people's households for wages, was the only one worth offering. Mrs. Pell, she would later decide, was a woman of sound judgment. The fire in the drawing room had been laid and lit by the time she was shown in, and the room was amber with it. The winter light outside the long windows already fading toward the early dark of February. She crossed the room to the windows and looked out at the parkland, bare and still and covered in the snow that had followed them from the White Hart like an undemanding companion, and she listened to the house settle around her, its sounds particular and identifiable, a creak in the east corridor, the clock on the mantel, the fire's steady industry. She heard him come into the room. She did not turn. "The portrait," she said. "I had it turned this morning," he said, "before we left the inn." She turned then. On the far wall, in a frame she had not looked at directly on her first crossing of the room, a young woman looked out at the drawing room with the clear and uncomplicated gaze of someone who had expected to live a long time. She was perhaps 20 in the portrait, She looked like a person of good faith. Josephine looked at the portrait for a long moment. "She would have found the accounts interesting," he said beside her. "She had a head for figures." "Then she would have caught the fraud sooner than I did," Josephine said. "Possibly," he said. And then, after a pause, "I would not have gone to the inn to find her." She looked at the fire instead of at him, at the light it threw across the floor, at the room it was making warm. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the mantelpiece beside the clock. Her letter, still folded, the creases worn now from handling. She looked at it, and then at him. "I thought," he said carefully, that it should stay here. Outside the long windows, the snow came down in the slow, committed way of snow that intends to last, settling over the parkland and the bare trees and the stone walls of Ashmore Hall, filling in the distances, making the world smaller and closer and warmer than it had been. The fire spoke quietly behind them. The clock marked the hour. She was 23 years old, and she had spent her last coin on a letter she had not signed, and it had brought her here, to this room, to this fire, to a man who had carried a wound 5 years and was learning, slowly, to set it down. She had not expected to be seen. She had not written the letter to be seen. She had written it because it was right. And right had, in the end, turned toward her like a window turned to face the light. The folded letter sat on the mantelpiece beside the clock, her initials in her own hand, and she was home.